I'm with Adam Levick from CAMERA. Now, Adam, you just recently had a webinar. What were you discussing and who were the speakers?
Jonathan Havarti was the moderator. He's the director of international affairs for B'nai B'rith UK, and he's also an author of books on anti-Semitism. And then the two speakers were myself and my co-editor Hadar Sela. Hadar Sela and I are editors of Camera UK, Camera's British department. Hadar spoke about the BBC, which is her specialty, and I spoke about the rest of the British media.
Are you seeing bad journalism or is this anti-Semitic journalism?
Well, look, I mean, I often say that I think that some of the what has really been atrocious coverage of Israel's war with Hamas since October 7th, some of it is clearly motivated by anti-Semitism, but we try not to use that word unless there's evidence that a particular journalist or outlet is anti-Semitic. So I'm not dismissing that as one of the factors, but I think the larger factor is even in the aftermath of what was the most atrocious, most barbaric, most deadly anti Semitic attack since the Holocaust, that media outlets which have been pro Palestinian, anti Israel, didn't have one of those aha moments. They didn't allow themselves to be, influenced to be changed in any way by the fact that, Israel was vindicated. Israel's concerns about Hamas were vindicated, and that the terrorist group that's prescribed by the UK and by the US and by the EU, obviously not only does want peace, but, its goal is to kill as many Jews as possible, whether be they men, women, or children. So one of the, kind of guiding principles that I have been stressing in contextualizing British media coverage of Israel is that their failure to acknowledge the horror of what happened on October 7th. And in fact, they've often tried to project that evil committed by Hamas onto the Jewish victims. You find their binary, Palestinians are the oppressed, Israelis are the oppressors, was not shaken by what happened on that dark Shabbat day. And in fact, quite the opposite. We found, for instance, at the Guardian, they began publishing op-eds and articles as early as a few days after the October 7th attack, accusing Israel of planning to carry out genocide or ethnic cleansing. This after a few days after Hamas attempted to carry out that exact crime. So, we have found that media outlets, to varying degrees, the Guardian being the most egregious, the BBC being more problematic because of its global influence. But we found that the really bad media outlets almost immediately began framing it not in terms of, Jewish victims of that barbaric attack, which included, as you know, murder, rape, torture, and mutilation, but as Israel was using it to carry out some malevolent plan to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza. And this kind of narrative took hold early on. And, we counted dozens of op-eds and articles in The Guardian the first 2 months of the war alone, accusing Israel of that crime. And in fact, some of the pro-Palestinian activists that are often highlighted by The Guardian were making this claim on October 7th and October 8th. So this is clearly a effort by pro-Palestinians to divert attention away from the Hamas crimes on October 7th and project them onto Jews. And this has colored the Guardian's coverage and a lot of the media outlets' coverage of the war. And, it's what we like to call a moral inversion. It turns the, perpetrators into the victims and the victims into the perpetrators. And, once they established that that's their framing and that their framing, it wasn't going to change, all the coverage, kind of stems from that premise. So, we've been, and I say this personally as an Israeli, I thought that maybe the extent of the barbarity of the attack, the barbarism, was such that maybe even media outlets that have been critical of Israel would maybe change their coverage just a bit to acknowledge that, their poor conviction about Palestinians was shaken by that day. But there's been no effort, no introspection, and in fact, quite the opposite. They've doubled down on their hatred of Israel since October 7th, and that's been very distressing, both as an Israeli and as a someone whose job is to promote accurate coverage of Israel. And there's been very little of that since October 7th.
Does bad journalism perpetuate anti-Semitism?
Oh, definitely. Look, I oftentimes say that the Guardian's coverage, for instance, is effectively pro-Hamas. And that's not to say that their editors and journalists are waving Hamas flags in their office. It just means that their coverage kind of gives, it's kind of almost like, it incites the anti-Semites, and it gives them confidence that their belief in Jewish villainy is correct, because their coverage, makes the Jewish state into this malign actor whose actions not only harm Palestinians but make the world worse. So, look, if I was anti-Semitic and I was looking for a mainstream outlet to read about the conflict, I would probably read The Guardian. So, I think
Mm.
by their coverage, by imputing the worst motives on Israeli Jews, by imputing the worst faith, by accusing them of the worst possible crimes, day in, day out, and by creating this caricature of Israeli villainy that is redolent of classic images of Jewish villainy, they do incite, their coverage does incite anti Semites, at least gives them the confidence that their hatred of Jews and the Jewish state, as the collective Jew, is correct. So I definitely think, in its worst, some of the media coverage does definitely incite anti-Semitism, and that's why you see, for instance, in the UK, the largest spike in anti-Semitism since the CST has been keeping stat since the mid 1980s, from October 7th to the end of the year, December 31st. It was the largest recorded number of instances of anti Semitism since the organizations have been keeping track. And you also find similar spikes in anti Semitism in the US and in France and in other European countries. So there's no question that the October 7th invasion of Israel and the Western media coverage of the aftermath and Israel's response to that kind of served as fuel for anti-Semitic hatred. And I think media outlets that have been among the worst really have a lot to answer for.
What sort of biases have you seen against Israel?
Oh, there's so many. Like, for one thing, they almost never mention Hamas's anti-Semitic charter, and the fact that Hamas's attack on October 7th wasn't motivated by, wanting two states, which, as you know, they oppose. So by omitting the fact that Hamas's rampage was based on pure Jew hatred, it denies news consumers important context by which to understand the attack, and by which to understand Israel's response. And moreover, I think you find Hamas has disappeared in media content since October 7th. If you were to scour British media's coverage of the war, as we do every day, you'd notice that photos of Hamas fighters or their weaponry are almost never shown, despite the fact that the IDF often shares photos of confiscated weapons that were hidden in homes, mosques, and hospitals on social media. In fact, even stock photos of the terror group or their rocket arsenal aren't used. The only thing you almost ever see, or at least the overwhelming majority of the time, is picture of destroyed Palestinian structures or homes or tunnels. Nothing, everything makes the war out to be purely an Israeli attack on Palestinians, not an attack on Hamas. So that is an extremely, extremely, biased way of reporting it, and I think it changed people's perception of the war. Another thing you see, which I find amazing, even after all this time, is that the media trusts Hamas claims on their statistics on fatalities since the war. You'd be hard pressed to find another regional war anywhere in the world where Western media outlets would trust fatality statistic provided by a prescribed terror group. Yet, almost, weekly, you see British media outlets cite Hamas's health ministry's claims of 30 some thousand killed since October 7th, most of whom they always add are women and children, despite the fact that, more objective analyses by reputable statisticians have demonstrated that Hamas's figures are impossible. That is, the data is statistically impossible. Also, the fact the media never mentions that Hamas doesn't distinguish in their data between terrorists and civilians. And in fact, we know from Israeli accounts that since the war, there's been about 14,000 Hamas combatants that have been killed. And also, Hamas's numbers don't mention those Palestinians in Gaza killed by their own misfired rockets. So, again, I find this astonishing that such a malevolent terrorist group, that their claims are taken at face value, where, in contrast, Israeli claims are usually skeptical. Another example, if you remember back in October, when Hamas claimed that Israeli planes attacked the Al Ahli hospital in Gaza, which they claimed killed an even 500 people, until it was proven beyond any doubt that it was actually a misfired Palestinian jihad rocket that landed in the hospital parking lot. Again, you have to ask yourself, why would Hamas's unevidenced claims be taken at face value by journalists whose job it is to critically scrutinize such accusations? I mean, the credulity in the face of Hamas claims by people whose job it is to be, to scrutinize and to critically think through what's happening in the news is just astonishing. So, that's certainly a huge part of the problem that we're finding.
And journalists ignoring Israel's security needs, so they're actually presenting the story in the wrong light.
Well, I mean, generally speaking, they're not talking about Israel's security needs at all. In fact, the interesting thing about the reporting of the unprecedented Iranian attack of over 300 drones and missiles into Israel yesterday, previous night, was their failure. Most reports failed to add the important context that Iranian proxies have been attacking Israeli territory pretty much every day for the past 6 months. In the face of Hezbollah and other Iranian-aligned terrorist groups operating from Syria and or Lebanon, in some cases Iraq. So it was framed instead as a retaliation of Israel's attack on IRGC general in Damascus. So but of course that attack by Israel, presumably by Israel, on that building that killed a bunch of terrorists, in fact, wasn't by all accounts actually a consulate like they reported, but it was a building that was being used by terrorists who were plotting more attacks on Israel. So, essentially, Iran declared war on Israel on October 8th, October 8th being the first missile that was launched into Israel by Hezbollah. And as you know, that subsequent rockets caused Israel to make the decision to evacuate roughly 70,000 Israelis from northern towns. And those Israelis still aren't back in their home because it's done not safe to do so. So, again, this is a case where the fundamental security needs of Israel are being ignored. The fundamental fact of Iran's malign influence in the region is being ignored. The fact that Iran controls proxy groups that are committed to Israel's destruction and have been firing onto Israel for months is ignored or downplayed. And so, sure, that's why when that attack occurred in the middle of the night, most news consumers probably didn't understand the context, and their understanding wasn't edified at all by media reports.
So we just had this attack with Iran onto Israel with over 300 drones and rockets. Are you already seeing bad journalism taking place because of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, like I just said, the problem with the coverage of the attack is it was framed often as a retaliation, almost in fact, there was a Guardian editorial that pretty much said that it was an understandable reaction to Israel's what they described as provocative attack on that Damascus building, which killed some high-level terrorists. So, while it's interesting, while Israel's Western allies have run to their defense, because they realize Iran is a malign actor that destabilizes the region and destabilizes the world. Media outlets were not outright, but in some cases, suggesting that Iran wasn't at all unreasonable in launching that attack, pointing to, again, that attack on the Damascus building. So, even something as straightforward as, this extremist Iranian regime, which calls for the destruction of Israel, who has, its proxies have killed Americans and Britons and other Westerners in various attacks. Even their malevolence is kind of downplayed in a way that can frame the story such that Israel is at least partially blamed for Iran's decision to launch 300 some projectiles at Israel. Now, some media outlets, get it better than others, but, I'm talking about the BBC, The Guardian, Sky News to some degree. There's just this insistence upon framing any situation in which Israel's at war in a way that shows Israel in the worst possible light. And I think there's a lot of factors for that, but I think there's kind of like this groupthink within the press corps. And I think it's once you have groupthink and a culture which assumes that in any situation Israel's claims must be doubted, then the coverage is going to reflect that. So I've been very disappointed by quite a few media outlets in their coverage of what was an unprecedented attack by the Iranian regime on Israeli territory.
You're here living in Israel. How did the attack affect you personally?
Well, my wife and I heard a lot of air activity overhead, about I don't know, 1:45 in the morning or so here. I think it was a combination of maybe Iron Dome interceptor rockets heading to meet their Iranian targets and some Israeli Air Force jets flying overhead to do what they needed to do. So while we didn't get at Seva Adom, we didn't get a red alert. It was clear something major was happening. And many of us here didn't get much sleep because of that. It's kind of surreal. I mean, as used to rockets from Gaza as we are, Again, this is the first time that a sovereign, major nation with a huge and accurate and sophisticated rocket arsenal launched an attack onto Israeli soil. And you can just hear overhead, even though we weren't thankfully near any of the explosions, we could hear overhead what was happening. And it was kind of surreal. I mean, it was, there's war and then there's war. This felt like a next level. And of course, we're all in Israel wondering what's going to happen next, what our government's response is going to be, and then whether Iran's going to respond to that. So obviously, nobody wants a regional war that includes Iran. At the same time, it's kind of commonly held view that Iran can't get away with such a unbelievably provocative act, firing hundreds of projectiles at our citizens without them exacting a cost. So people ask me what's going to happen next, and I don't know, but I can't imagine that the this is going to be the end of it.
Now, Iran launched these weapons, drones, and rockets, and it was going to take a couple of hours for them to actually reach Israeli sovereignty. So, did you have a sense of fear, waiting and anticipating what was going to happen?
Yeah, definitely. I kept on expecting the red alert, the Safa Dome alarm to ring. It never did. And yeah, it did. The sense of my family's own personal security it was a different level. Fortunately, we don't live near the south, so we didn't suffer the way residents of Kfar Aza and Be'eri and other Gaza envelope border towns did on October 7th. And even in the subsequent weeks when there was rocket fire, we're in the middle, so we're kind of safe. But it's a whole other threat when it comes for Iran because, as you know, they have rockets that are able to hit all over the country, and they have very sophisticated rockets. So yeah, there was a sense that, are we next? Are we going to find an actual explosion that's going to happen in Modi'in? When a relatively powerful state actor decides to launch a war against your country, it's as horrible as October 7th was. Iran's capacity to inflict damage, and certainly, for instance, their desire to build a nuclear weapon and their increasingly sophisticated ballistic rocket technology, I would say our level of fear was higher than it usually is.
Are you proud of the Israeli Air Force and what they done on that night?
Extremely, extremely. And I guess that's another part of the story that, I mean, I've certainly been seeing in the Israeli media, but there is a sense of, our military succeeded beyond all levels of expectation. And I think there was only a couple of rockets that got through, one that hit an air base, and there was shrapnel from a intercepted rocket that severely injured a 7-year-old girl in a Bedouin town near Arad. But it does make me sleep better at night knowing that we have this incredible defense system and that, considering the large bevy of rockets, considering the scale of the attack and the fact that so many of them were shot down makes me very proud to be an Israeli and very proud of our military.
Going back to the journalism, have you seen errors that you've caught being changed by some of these media outlets?
Oh yeah, I mean, camera gets corrections all the time. For instance, my colleague Tamar Sternthal, who also works in the Israel office, got a newswire called UPI, United Press International, to change a article which originally claimed, as if it was a fact, that the Israeli attack on Damascus hit the Iranian consulate. Now, I don't know if you've been following this in detail, but the claim that the Israeli attack on April 1st hit a consulate was merely based on Iranian claims. In fact, the U.S. State Department pushed back against those claims, saying that they have no information at the time that it was actually a consulate, that it was just a building that was used by terrorists. So my colleague complained to UPI and to McClatchy, which owns a lot of newspapers in the U.S., which run UPI stories, and they retracted the claim. So we find that by following the news in real time and by pushing back against false claims, bad coverage can become better. Now, our goals are relatively modest. We're not going to suddenly wake up one day and find the Western media to be fair with Israel, but we find that if we appeal to their own sense of professionalism, their own ethics, that we can make positive impact on media coverage and get them to at least retract patently false claims.
What is your prayer for Israel at this time?
Oh, well, look, I mean, we're going into the Passover holiday, and it's about, of course, it's a holiday about freedom from slavery. And I think this war, however it turns out, then I think the story has not been written. We don't know what's going to happen in a few days. You don't know in the next few months. But I think the Passover holiday brings to us how important it is that we have Jewish sovereignty, that we're no longer slaves, that we have agency and power and the strength to challenge our enemies when our enemies seek our destruction. So I hope for peace, of course. I hope that Hamas surrenders. I hope the war is over tomorrow. I don't think that's going to happen. I hope Iran decides not to, attack us again. But I'm also realistic, and I think this war is probably going to go on for a while. And I'm just hoping that we remain united and that we are able to celebrate Passover next year in peace.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more?
Yeah, it's camera.org. That's CAMERA.org. Or our UK branch, which I work at with my colleague Hadar, is camera-uk.org. And at those sites, you can find all of our posts and links. We're also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And but I guess the best place, the easiest place for your listeners to go to is just the website camera.org.
Okay, well, Adam, thank you very much for sharing today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.